I never think about the play I just made. I'm always thinking about the next play. Lionel Messi. There's a particular kind of athlete who defies the frameworks we use to understand greatness. Most elite competitors can be studied through a single dominant characteristic, a relentless work ethic, a volcanic competitive rage, a tactical intelligence that borders on chess mastery. Most great athletes give you one clear answer when you ask why they were great. Lionel Messi gives you something harder to categorize. He gives you a stillness, a quietness, a calm so total and so persistent that it almost looks like the absence of effort. And that is precisely where the confusion begins. Because what looks like effortlessness in Lionel Messi is actually something far more interesting. It is the end product of a lifetime of work so deep, so specific, so obsessively repeated that it has been fully absorbed into reflex. What you see when you watch Messi is not a man performing. It is a man who has long since stopped needing to perform because everything he needs has already been built into the structure of his body and mind. To understand Messi is to understand a particular kind of genius, not the explosive, announcing kind, not the kind that walks into a room and demands recognition. Messi's genius is the kind that accumulates quietly, builds silently, and then suddenly manifests in a moment of such clarity that the people watching it are left speechless. His coaches speak about him in careful language. His teammates describe him in fragments because the full picture is too large to hold in a single sentence. His opponents, when pushed to articulate what made him so difficult to stop, often fall back on one word. They say he was impossible. Not difficult. Not exceptional. Impossible. The question this script is trying to answer is not whether Messi was the greatest footballer of his generation or perhaps of all time. That debate has been had, and it continues to be had. It will likely never be fully resolved because greatness at that level resists simple measurement. The question this script is trying to answer is different. It is asking, what was actually happening inside this man? What mental structures, what habits of thought, what emotional patterns, what early experiences combined to produce a player who could do what no one else could do for longer than anyone else could do it? What is the architecture of Messi's greatness? To answer that, we have to go back. We have to go back to a small city in Argentina called Rosario. And we have to look at a small boy who barely spoke, who spent most of his time alone or with a ball, and who was already, even then, operating by a set of principles that would define the next 4 decades of his life. Lionel Andres Messi was born on June 24th, 1987, in Rosario, Santa Fe, Argentina. He was the third of 4 children born to Jorge Messi, a steel factory worker, and Celia Cucitini, a cleaner. The neighborhood they lived in was called Las Heras. It was a working-class district, not desperately poor, but modest in the way that most of working-class Argentina is modest. The house was small. The street outside was where the children played. From the very earliest accounts of people who knew Messi as a child, one thing stands out above everything else. He was shy, profoundly, almost architecturally shy. He was not the kind of shy that comes from insecurity or fear of rejection. It was something quieter than that. He simply seemed to exist inside himself more than outside himself. He observed the world carefully, but participated in it selectively. He was not withdrawn in a way that suggested unhappiness. He was withdrawn in a way that suggested he was constantly paying attention to something that other people could not see. His grandmother, Celia Oliveira Cucitini, for whom he later dedicated many of his most important goals, was the person who first took him seriously as a footballer. She brought him to the local club, Grandoli, when he was 4 years old. The coach at the time was initially reluctant to play him because of his small size. She insisted, he played. And from that first moment, those who watched him described something immediate and unmistakable. The ball did not bounce off him the way it bounced off other children. It seemed to stick. It seemed to belong to him. This is worth pausing on because it tells us something important. Even at 4 years old, even before any systematic training had taken place, Messi's relationship with the ball was qualitatively different from other children's. This was not just natural talent in the sense of being born with physical gifts. It was something more specific. It was an almost instinctive attunement to the object. The ball was not a tool he was learning to use. It was already an extension of himself. He played for Grandoli until age 8. By then, he was already playing against children who were significantly older, and he was already the best player on the pitch in every game he entered. His father joined his coaching staff as a way of managing and supporting his development. His older brothers, Rodrigo and Matias, were also footballers, and the family's life was already organized, in large part, around the game. For Messi, football was not something he did. It was the environment he lived in. It was the air around him. At age 8, he joined the youth academy of Newell's Old Boys, one of Rosario's 2 major clubs. It was here that things began to accelerate. The team he joined was called La Máquina, the Machine. It was one of the most talented youth sides in Argentine football history, and their record was extraordinary. In the span of a few years, they played approximately 500 games and lost approximately 5 of them. Messi was not just a part of that team. He was its engine. He was the player around whom the entire structure of the side was organized. Teammates from that era remember a boy who was quiet before games, focused and still during games, and equally quiet after them. He did not celebrate loudly. He did not sulk after errors. He simply moved to the next moment. This behavioral pattern is significant. Most elite athletes, especially at youth level, display their emotional investment openly. They celebrate with abandon, react to mistakes with frustration, seek validation from coaches and peers. Messi did almost none of this. His emotional life seemed to be happening somewhere beneath the surface, in a layer that was not easily visible to those around him. He was processing everything, but he was processing it internally. This early pattern of emotional containment would become one of the most defining features of his adult career. Then, at age 10, something happened that threatened to end everything. Messi was diagnosed with growth hormone deficiency. His body was not producing the hormones it needed to grow at a normal rate. He was small for his age, and without treatment, the gap between him and his peers would only widen. The treatment existed, it was available, but it cost approximately $900 per month, a sum that was completely beyond the means of the Messi family. Newell's old boys were willing to cover some of the cost, but could not commit to covering all of it. The situation was unstable and uncertain. For 2 years, the treatment was inconsistent. The physical and emotional toll on a young boy who was already sensitive and introverted was significant. This period of Messi's life is often treated as a brief obstacle, a difficulty he overcame on his way to greatness. But it was more than that. It was a crucible. It was the period during which something was forged in him that would later appear again and again as one of the most distinctive features of his psychology. It forged in him a particular relationship with adversity, not the kind of relationship that produces defiance or anger or a burning desire to prove others wrong. Something quieter than that. Something more like acceptance combined with absolute refusal. He accepted the difficulty. He did not dramatize it. He did not use it as fuel for a narrative of victimhood or revenge. He simply continued. He continued to play. He continued to train. He continued to be, in every context, the best player on the pitch, as if the medical situation and the football situation existed in separate compartments of his life, and he would handle each one as it came. This quality, the ability to hold difficulty in one hand and excellence in the other, without letting them contaminate each other, would define him throughout his career. In 2000, a solution appeared. FC Barcelona, who had been scouting South American youth talent aggressively, sent a representative to Argentina. Carlos Rexach, Barcelona's technical director at the time, watched Messi train for a total of approximately 2 minutes before making his decision. The story of what happened next is one of the most famous in football. With no contract form available, Rexach allegedly wrote his commitment to sign Messi on a paper napkin. The family moved to Barcelona. The club agreed to cover the cost of the hormone treatment, and Lionel Messi, at age 13, left everything he had ever known and arrived in a foreign country where he did not know the language, the culture, or the people. What is remarkable is what he did not do. He did not struggle visibly. He did not collapse under the weight of homesickness. He found the training ground at La Masia, Barcelona's famous youth academy, and he did what he had always done. He trained, he played, he made the ball do what only he could make it do. His teammates at La Masia remember a boy who was even quieter than they expected, almost to the point of seeming absent. He barely spoke during meals. He barely engaged in the social rituals of dormitory life. But on the training pitch, everything was different. On the training pitch, he was completely and absolutely present. This is the first major principle that defines Lionel Messi's greatness, and it is perhaps the most fundamental. It is his ability to be completely present on the football pitch in a way that he is almost nowhere else, not as a performance, not as a technique he has learned, but as the natural condition of his relationship with football. The pitch was where he was most fully himself, and that total presence gave him an attentional precision that other players simply did not possess. The first principle is what might be called the silent accumulation of mastery through obsessive repetition. From his earliest days at La Masia, Messi trained with a focus and a repetitiveness that separated him even from the other talented children around him. His former teammate and fellow La Masia product Gerard Piqué has spoken about watching Messi on the training ground in those early years, doing the same moves over and over again, not because a coach told him to, not because he was following a prescribed program, but because he was not satisfied until the execution was perfect. And then, after it was perfect, he continued doing it, because perfection was not the end point. Automaticity was the end point. He wanted the movement to require no thought whatsoever. He wanted it to live in his muscles. This distinction is crucial, and it is one that is poorly understood in popular discussions of athletic genius. There is a common assumption that the great ones are great because of their natural talent, and that talent is something separate from and prior to work. But Messi's development tells a different story. His natural talent gave him a starting point and a direction. But what built the actual architecture of his game was thousands and thousands of hours of obsessive, specific, targeted repetition. He was not practicing in the sense of going through motions. He was engineering his own neurology. He was laying down pathways in his nervous system that would later fire with a speed and reliability that would make him look supernatural. Pep Guardiola, who coached Messi during what many consider his greatest years at Barcelona, has spoken about this with great precision. He has described watching Messi in the days before and after matches, working on specific movements in a corner of the training ground by himself. Not the movements that coaches had asked him to practice. His own movements he felt were not yet perfectly automatic. This self-directed refinement was entirely typical of him. He did not wait to be told what to improve. He diagnosed his own game continuously and treated its imperfections as personal problems to be solved through work. There is a specific story that illuminates this principle with particular clarity. In the early years of his time in Barcelona's first team, Messi was predominantly a right-footed player. His left foot was functional but not dominant. Over the period of approximately 2 seasons, through work that was almost entirely self-initiated, he developed his left foot to the point where opponents could not reliably guess which foot he would use. The process required not just technical practice, but a willingness to actively disadvantage himself in training situations by forcing himself to use his weaker foot, even when the natural, instinctive option was to use his right. He was deliberately creating difficulty for himself in the present in order to expand his capability in the future. This is a form of discipline that looks very different from the aggressive, punishing discipline we usually associate with elite athletes. It is patient, it is quiet, but it is absolute. The deeper principle here is not just about hard work. Every elite athlete works hard. The principle is about the nature of the work. Messi was obsessively specific. He was not interested in general fitness or general improvement. He was interested in the precise micro details of his technique and decision-making. He would work on the exact angle of his first touch in a particular situation. He would rehearse the specific timing of a dribble against a pressing defender. He was building a library of movements so vast and so detailed that when a real game situation arose, he had already solved it. The game, for him, was not the place where he figured things out. The game was the place where he deployed what he had already figured out. This is why watching Messi in his prime could produce an almost eerie sensation in viewers who understood the game. He never seemed to be reacting to the game. He seemed to be slightly ahead of it, as if he were playing from a script that only he had read. That was, in a very literal sense, exactly what was happening. His obsessive repetition of specific scenarios in training meant that by the time those scenarios appeared in matches, his response was already encoded. The thinking had already been done. What you were watching was the output of work that had happened months and years before the game you were watching. This pattern of obsessive repetition appears again and again across every phase of his career. It is not a youthful characteristic that he grew out of as he became more established. It became, if anything, more refined and more targeted as he aged. Former Barcelona fitness coaches have noted that Messi's approach to training was unusual in the sense that he never treated a session as complete until he had executed whatever he was working on at the level he privately required. Not the level the coaching staff required, his own level. He was the author of his own standards, and those standards never had a ceiling. There is something important to understand about the nature of this repetitive work. It was not random or general. It was surgical. Messi did not practice football in the way that an athlete might practice a sport, in the general sense of putting in hours. He practiced specific moments, specific movements, specific decisions that he had identified as requiring refinement. He observed himself in matches with the same detachment a scientist might apply to experimental data. He noted errors not with frustration, but with the cool interest of someone who has identified a problem they intend to solve. And then he went to the training ground and worked on precisely that problem until it was solved. The feedback loop was tight and continuous. Observe, identify, practice, refine, return to competition. This process was so internalized, so naturally part of his relationship with the game, that those around him often did not even notice it was happening. He was not announcing his self-improvement. He was simply quietly improving. The Messi who played in October was always fractionally different from the Messi who had played in August. Not visibly different to most observers, but different in the precise, cumulative way that produces, over years and decades, the gap between ordinary excellence and something that defies ordinary measurement. The second principle is what might be called the geometry of simplicity. One of the most consistent observations made by analysts, coaches, and former opponents about Messi is that his game, at its core, is built on an almost radical simplicity of decision-making. This seems paradoxical given the complexity of what he does on the ball. His dribbling sequences involve multiple feints, changes of direction, changes of pace, and micro-adjustments that appear impossibly complex in slow-motion replays. Yet the decisions that produce those sequences are, at root, extremely simple. This is a principle that Guardiola in particular has tried to articulate multiple times. He has described Messi as the player with the fewest wasted decisions he has ever seen. What he means by this is that Messi almost never makes the elaborate choice when the simple choice is available. He almost never chooses the difficult solution when an easy one exists. The dribbling, the complexity of movement appears when the simple solution has been closed off. It is not Messi's first language, it is his contingency protocol. Consider how this manifests in his goal-scoring record. A significant proportion of Messi's career goals are not the kind of goals that fill highlight reels. They are short-range finishes, tap-ins from close range, precise placed shots at the near post, penalties. They are goals that look almost anticlimactic given the complexity of the build-up play. And that is precisely the point. The build-up play, the dribbling past 3 defenders, the driving run from midfield, the perfectly weighted pass that splits the defense, all of that serves one purpose: to create a moment of simplicity, to manufacture, from chaos, a situation simple enough for a child to finish. Messi runs himself and the defense into complexity so that his final action can be simple. The simplicity at the end is not accidental. It is the product of immense deliberate effort earlier in the sequence. This principle extended to his passing and his reading of the game as well. Those who played alongside him consistently describe a player who never seemed to be looking for the spectacular pass when the safe pass was available. He would take the easy option, keep the ball moving, and wait. He was not trying to create brilliance. He was managing space, managing the tempo of the game, managing the defensive structure of the opponent. When the brilliant option appeared, he took it, but he never forced it. He never imposed complexity on a situation that did not require it. He had a patience in his decision-making that was genuinely unusual. He could hold the ball, body balanced perfectly, eyes scanning, and simply wait until the right moment. Not the exciting moment, the right moment. This relationship with simplicity is, paradoxically, one of the hardest things to achieve in football. The game produces enormous pressure at every moment to do something spectacular, to justify your reputation, to respond to the crowd's desire for drama. Less gifted players often try to manufacture complexity because they believe complexity is what marks them as skilled. Messi understood, at a very deep level, that the highest skill is the production of the correct outcome with minimum wasted energy. That is a profoundly mature and unusually sophisticated understanding of the game, and it is one that he operated by from a very young age. The third principle is what can be described as the economy of the body as a complete weapon. Messi's physical situation is well known. He is, by the standards of elite football, a small man. He stands at approximately 169 centimeters, which in international football terms puts him among the shorter players at virtually every level he competed at. His growth hormone treatment during adolescence allowed him to reach normal adult height, but it did not make him tall. And unlike some smaller players who compensate through athleticism, Messi is not built like a sprinter. He is not heavily muscled. He does not have the explosive, angular body of someone who has spent years in the weight room trying to compensate for a lack of size. What he has instead is a center of gravity so low and so stable that it creates a completely different relationship between him and the physical world of the game. His hips, when he runs, are lower to the ground than virtually any other player at his level. This means that when he changes direction, he does not have to decelerate and rebalance in the way that taller players do. He can change direction while still accelerating, because the rotational mechanics of his body allow it. He can absorb contact from defenders who are significantly larger than him without losing his balance, because his center of mass is simply further from where the contact is happening. What is remarkable about Messi's relationship to his physical attributes is that he did not build his game in spite of them. He built his game around them in a way that transformed what looked like limitations into advantages. His low center of gravity became the foundation of a dribbling style that was unique in the history of the game. The way he absorbs contact without falling became a kind of passive defensive weapon. Defenders who expected to knock him off the ball often found that the contact dissipated into him and he continued moving, which created a disorienting and demoralizing effect. But the deeper principle here is about self-knowledge. From a very young age, Messi understood what his body could and could not do. He did not spend energy trying to play a physical game he was not built for. He did not try to win aerial duels or bully defenders in the way that certain other types of forwards do. He identified the specific physical advantages his body gave him, namely the low gravity, the tight control of the ball under pressure, the ability to change direction without losing speed, and he built his entire technical identity around maximizing those advantages. He made himself unborrowable. His style worked for him, and only for him, because it was built on the specific geometry of his specific body. This is a principle that applies far beyond football. The elite mind does not try to be what it is not. It performs a rigorous and honest audit of its actual capabilities and builds its approach around reality. Messi's game was always anchored in what was true about him. That anchor is what gave it its extraordinary stability across 2 decades of elite competition. The fourth principle is what might be called emotional architecture, the discipline of feelings. Messi is not an emotional performer. He never has been. He does not shout at teammates. He does not celebrate with a fist raised at the sky and a scream that carries across the stadium. He does not point to the badge on his shirt. He does not stare opponents down. He does not conduct conversations with referees. He plays in a kind of emotional silence that is almost monastic. This is not an absence of feeling. That is the crucial point, and it is one that observers who simply see his quiet exterior often miss entirely. People who have been close to Messi at various points in his career, teammates, coaches, family members, consistently describe a man of enormous emotional depth and intensity. He cares, profoundly and completely, about everything connected to football. He cares about winning. He cares about performing well. He cares about his teammates. He cares about the supporters. But he manages the expression of those feelings through a discipline that is, in its own way, as impressive as anything he does with a football. The function of this emotional management is not to suppress feeling. It is to prevent feeling from interfering with performance. When Messi makes an error in a match, the emotional response is not visible on his face. He does not hang his head. He does not kick the ground. He does not lose his physical composure. He moves to the next moment with what appears to be total equanimity. This behavior is not natural to someone who feels as deeply as he does. It is the product of an enormous disciplinary effort, one that he seems to have developed very early and maintained consistently throughout his career. There is a pattern that anyone who has watched enough Messi matches will recognize. When things go wrong for Barcelona or for Argentina, when a goal is conceded, when the team is under pressure, when the flow of the game has turned against them, Messi does not retreat into either rage or despair. He becomes, if anything, more focused. The eyes narrow slightly. The movement becomes more deliberate. He seems to calculate something, and then within minutes, almost as if to order, he does something that changes the game. This is not a coincidence. It is the product of an emotional system that has been trained to convert distress into focus, rather than into reaction. This pattern is visible throughout his career, but it is perhaps most clearly visible in the history of his relationship with the Argentina national team. That history is long and painful, and it will be examined in more detail later in this script. But the relevant point here is that across many years of international failure, across lost finals and missed penalties and deeply personal public criticism, Messi's fundamental emotional architecture never broke. He was not unchanged by those experiences. No person could be. But he processed them in the way he processed everything. Internally, quietly, and with an ultimate orientation toward the next match rather than the last one. Jorge Valdano, the former Argentina footballer and manager who has written extensively about Messi, has described this quality as one of the most unusual he has encountered in the game. He notes that most great players, when they fail, need something to push back against. They need an enemy, a slight that can be converted into motivation. Messi does not need that. He carries his motivation in a place that external events cannot reliably reach. He does not need to be angry to be extraordinary. He needs only to be on the pitch. It is worth dwelling on one specific and well-documented expression of this emotional architecture, because it illuminates the principle with unusual precision. In the 2012 Champions League semifinal against Chelsea, Barcelona were eliminated on away goals after a match that contained several controversial refereeing decisions. The frustration in the Barcelona camp was visible and vocal. Players argued. Coaches protested. The emotional aftermath was turbulent and public. In the middle of all of this, Messi was observed in the tunnel after the match, silent, still, eyes focused on some internal point. He did not engage with the controversy around him. He processed his own disappointment in a private space that the surrounding drama could not reach. In the weeks that followed that elimination, Messi trained with increased intensity and precision. He did not speak publicly about the injustice. He did not use the defeat as material for a narrative about being wronged. He converted the distress into energy and directed that energy toward the next challenge. Barcelona went on the following season to produce some of the most extraordinary football they had played in years, and Messi was at the center of it, as sharp and as focused and as dominant as he had ever been. This is the pattern. Distress becomes focus. Loss becomes information. The emotion does not disappear. It is redirected. This is not suppression. This is something more sophisticated, the ability to choose the destination toward which difficult feelings travel. The fifth principle is what can be described as the paradox of invisibility, the ability to shape a game without the ball. There is a version of Messi that the casual observer sees. It is a player who takes the ball, dribbles past several defenders, and scores or creates a goal. That version is real, but it is incomplete. The more complete version, the version that defines his actual effect on a match, involves understanding what he does for the 45 minutes of each half when he does not have the ball. Messi's movement without the ball is one of the least discussed and most important aspects of his game. He moves in ways that create problems for defensive structures even before the ball reaches him. His positioning pulls defenders out of shape. His apparent stillness in one area of the pitch creates questions in the minds of the opposing players. Is he leaving that space for a reason? Is he waiting to run? Should I track him there? Should I hold my position? These questions, even when they are not consciously articulated by the defenders, produce micro-hesitations and micro-adjustments in the defensive structure that create space for other players. Guardiola has spoken about this in several of his post-career reflections. He describes a Messi who, even when he was not touching the ball, was affecting the geometry of every defensive block the opposition tried to set up. Defenders could not treat his position as neutral. Every time he moved or did not move, it required a decision from someone on the opposing side. And because he was Messi, the threat attached to any position he occupied was sufficient to force a response. This forced response without touching the ball is a form of influence that very few players in the history of the game have been able to exercise. His false nine role, which Guardiola introduced at Barcelona, and which became one of the defining tactical innovations of that era of football, was built almost entirely on this principle. In the false nine, Messi played nominally as a central striker, but consistently dropped deep into midfield to receive the ball. This created an impossible problem for the opposing center backs. If they followed him, they left space in behind them that other runners could exploit. If they did not follow him, he received the ball in midfield with the freedom to pick passes and drive forward against disorganized defensive lines. The role worked not because of any single technical skill Messi possessed, but because of the unique quality of his presence. His capacity to threaten from anywhere on the pitch simultaneously was so established that the mere act of him occupying a space made that space important. This principle, the ability to shape the game through positioning and implied threat, is one of the most sophisticated in football. It requires not just individual quality, but a deep understanding of collective dynamics, of how defensive structures respond to positional stimulus, of how to use your own reputation as a weapon. Messi understood all of this intuitively. He was, in effect, playing chess on a football pitch, and the piece he was moving was himself. The sixth principle concerns what can only be described as a kind of competitive vigilance that never sleeps. There is a common misconception about players who operate with Messi's apparent serenity. The misconception is that serenity equals complacency, that a player who does not display visible competitive fire is somehow less motivated than one who does. In Messi's case, this could not be further from the truth. His external calm conceals a competitive intensity that those closest to him have consistently described as all-consuming. Carles Puyol, who was Barcelona's captain and defensive leader during the early years of Messi's rise, has spoken about the competitive character he observed in the younger player. He notes that Messi hated losing, even in training, not in a demonstrative way. He did not throw things or shout at referees, but the internal response to losing was visceral and total. He would become quieter, more focused. He would train with increased precision and concentration in the days following a defeat. He processed the loss as information, as data about what needed to be corrected, and he used that data to recalibrate. This is a form of competitive drive that is actually rarer and more durable than the visible, emotional kind. The player who shouts and pounds his chest when he wins is announcing his emotional investment. But that kind of announcement is also, to some degree, a release. The feeling peaks and then diminishes. Messi's competitive drive does not seem to work through peaks and releases. It seems to operate at a constant, stable, high-intensity level that neither spikes with success nor bottoms out with failure. It is the engine running behind the quiet exterior, always at full capacity, never advertised, never shut off. His obsession with the Ballon d'Or, the award given annually to the world's best footballer, is one of the clearest windows into this less visible competitive dimension of his character. Messi won the award 8 times, a record that may never be matched. But the number that illuminates his competitive psychology is not 8. It is the number of times in his career that he fell short of winning it when he felt, privately, that he should have won it. Sources close to him have described a man who, in those years, processed the defeat with exactly the same analytical intensity he applied to football results. He examined the reasons. He identified what he could control. He recalibrated. He continued. There's another layer to this competitive vigilance. It is his relationship with his own standards. Messi set his personal benchmarks at a level that the rest of the football world could not access. This meant that matches, which the outside world perceived as good performances, were, in Messi's private accounting, inadequate. Seasons that would be the best season in the career of virtually any other player in the world were, to Messi, seasons where he had left something on the table. This internal standard setting is one of the defining characteristics of the highest performing athletes across all sports. The standard is not external. It is not set by coaches or records or trophies. It is set by an internal reference point that seems to be permanently positioned slightly beyond what has already been achieved, close enough to reach, far enough to demand everything. This trait, the calibration of competitive drive to its maximum regardless of the stakes of the moment, is one of the recurring patterns across his entire career. It appears in the youth team matches at Newell's Old Boys, it appears in training sessions at La Masia, it appears in preseason friendlies at Barcelona, and in practice games at Argentina camps. The setting changes. The level of external importance assigned to the occasion changes. The level of internal effort that Messi applies does not change. It is always the same, always maximum. This is not something that can be coached into a player. It is a fundamental characteristic of how they are built. The seventh principle is what might be called the architecture of a relationship, specifically his relationship with teammates. Messi is not a vocal leader. He does not give speeches. He does not organize tactical meetings. He does not mentor younger players in the way that certain veteran athletes cultivate a public identity as a wise elder of the game. He leads through a different mechanism, one that is harder to describe but impossible to miss if you spend time around any team he has been part of. He leads through absolute consistency. When your most gifted teammate shows up every single day, trains with more focus than anyone else, produces more often than anyone else, and never asks for special treatment or special dispensation. It creates a particular kind of standard within the group. It makes it impossible to coast. It makes it embarrassing to give less than everything. Not because Messi makes anyone feel ashamed, he never does that, but because his example simply makes a different standard visible. The group can see what total commitment looks like. They can see it in the most obvious person in their midst. And the effect of that visibility on the collective effort of a team is profound. His relationship with specific teammates also tells us something important about his social intelligence. Messi forms deep bonds with a small number of people. His friendships with Dani Alves during the Barcelona years, his relationship with Sergio Aguero, his closest friend in football, with whom he grew up playing alongside in Argentina youth teams, his close connection with Gerard Piqué. These relationships are not surface-level professional relationships. They are genuine, long-standing connections that Messi maintains with real care and real investment. What this tells us is that his introversion is not the same as disconnection. He is deeply connected to a small number of people, deeply present in those relationships, and deeply loyal. This creates within any team he is part of a core of players who feel genuinely close to him and who will therefore go to extraordinary lengths to support him. The story of Barcelona's greatest years is in many ways the story of a group of players who were deeply connected to each other and to Messi specifically, and who found in that connection a source of energy that drove them beyond their individual limits. But his relationship with teammates also illuminates something about his understanding of football as a collective enterprise. Despite his individual brilliance, despite the fact that he has personally won more matches than many teams have, Messi has always spoken about football in collective terms. He defines his success through the success of his team. When Barcelona won the Champions League, he spoke about what the group had built. When Argentina finally won the World Cup in 2022, the emotion that came from him was not the emotion of personal vindication, though that was certainly part of it. It was the emotion of collective accomplishment, of a group of people achieving together something that none of them could have achieved alone. This relationship with the collective is not a performance of humility. It reflects something genuine about how he understands the game. Football is not a sport where individual genius is sufficient. It requires combination, movement, trust, shared understanding. Messi knows this better than anyone, and his approach to teammates reflects that knowledge. The eighth principle is one of the most fascinating, and it concerns his relationship with failure, specifically the long, painful, defining failure of his international career with Argentina. From 2007 to 2021, Messi represented Argentina in 4 Copa America finals and 1 World Cup final. Argentina lost all 5. The defeats were not always close. Some were brutal. The 2016 Copa America final, in which Argentina lost to Chile on penalties, was followed by Messi announcing his retirement from international football in a press conference, where his voice cracked and his face carried the weight of a man who had been fighting a particular battle for a very long time, and had concluded that he would never win it. The public reaction to Argentina's repeated failures was, at various points, directed personally at Messi. Argentine football culture is passionate and demanding and sometimes cruel. There were voices within Argentina that questioned whether Messi truly cared about the national team. There were comparisons to Diego Maradona, who had led Argentina to World Cup glory in 1986, and who represented, for many Argentine fans, the standard against which all Argentine players would always be measured. The comparisons were unfair and often hysterical, but they were also relentless, and they came from a place of genuine longing for something that Messi had not yet given them. What is remarkable, studied from the outside, is the way Messi's relationship with this failure evolved over 15 years. He did not close down or retreat from the national team, despite the criticism and despite the pain of the repeated near misses. He came back. He reversed his 2016 retirement and returned to the squad. He continued to play, continued to try, continued to believe that the outcome could be different. This is not the behavior of a man who has given up. and it is not the behavior of a man who has been destroyed by failure. It is the behavior of a man who has found a way to hold failure at a particular distance, to neither deny it nor be consumed by it, but to continue functioning alongside it. There is something philosophically unusual about this. Most discussions of elite athlete psychology around failure focus on the ability to bounce back, to reset quickly, to move to the next challenge without being derailed. Messi does all of those things, but the specific challenge he faced with Argentina was different because it did not resolve quickly. It stretched across a decade and a half. The ability to sustain motivation and engagement and effort across that kind of sustained, unresolved failure is not a basic psychological resilience skill. It is something much rarer and much harder to cultivate. What he said in various interviews during that period offers clues about how he managed it. He spoke consistently about wanting to win for the team, not for himself. He spoke about the people around him, the other players who were also working toward the same goal and deserving of the same outcome. He seemed to externalize his motivation onto others rather than anchoring it purely in his own desire. This is a form of motivational displacement that serves an important function. When your own desire is not enough to sustain you, when the personal narrative around winning and losing becomes too heavy to carry, you can shift the weight onto the collective. You are no longer just fighting for yourself. You are fighting for the group. And that is a load that is, paradoxically, both heavier and easier to bear. When Argentina finally won the Copa America in 2021, defeating Brazil in the final, and then when they won the World Cup in Qatar in 2022, the emotional scenes involving Messi were unlike anything the football world had seen. He wept. He was speechless. He held the trophy and seemed unable to fully process that it was real. And what was moving about those moments was not just the joy of winning, it was the recognition of what had been paid, the 15 years of carrying something heavy, the defeats, the criticism, the retirements and unretirements. All of that accumulated weight was visible in the face of a man who had finally put it down. But the deeper principle in this story is not about winning. It is about the 15 years before the winning. It is about the ability to sustain elite performance across a period of sustained, high-profile, personally painful failure. It is about the refusal to let the result corrupt the process. Messi kept training. He kept showing up. He kept playing the best football he could play for Argentina, even in matches that ended in defeat, even in tournaments that ended in tears. The quality of his work for Argentina during those years was extraordinary. He continued to be, even in the failing, one of the greatest players on the pitch. He gave everything he had to a cause that kept failing him. That is not a failure of character, that is a triumph of it. But the deeper principle in this story is not about winning. It is about the 15 years before the winning. It is about the ability to sustain elite performance across a period of sustained, high-profile, personally painful failure. It is about the refusal to let the result corrupt the process. Messi kept training. He kept showing up. He kept playing the best football he could play for Argentina, even in matches that ended in defeat, even in tournaments that ended in tears. The quality of his work for Argentina during those years was extraordinary. He continued to be, even in the failing, one of the greatest players on the pitch. He gave everything he had to a cause that kept failing him. That is not a failure of character. That is a triumph of it. There is a specific and important dimension of the Argentina story that is often overlooked in the broad narrative of suffering and ultimate redemption. During those 15 years of finals losses, Messi did not allow the weight of the expectation to change how he played. He did not become conservative in big moments to protect himself from criticism. He did not begin to make safer choices that could be defended in the post-match analysis. He continued to make the bold choice, the decisive intervention, the forward pass that might be intercepted. He continued to attempt the things that only he could attempt, even knowing that if they failed, the criticism would be immediate and personal. This is a form of courage that is rarely named as such. The courage to keep being yourself under conditions that are specifically designed to make you into something smaller. The 2014 World Cup final against Germany is perhaps the clearest example. Argentina lost in extra time to a Götze goal. Messi had been Argentina's best player across the tournament, winning the Golden Ball award for best player of the competition. In the final, he had several moments of individual brilliance and one clear chance that he was unable to convert. The post-match analysis in certain quarters focused on that missed chance, on whether Messi had been sufficiently decisive. But the broader picture is undeniable. He was, in a losing team, the player who came closest to changing the outcome. He was, in failure, still exceptional. That is a rare and precise form of courage. The ninth principle concerns what can be called temporal intelligence, the ability to change while remaining yourself. One of the most common trajectories for elite athletes is a period of peak performance followed by gradual decline as the body ages, and the gap between physical capacity and the demands of elite competition widens. The most talented athletes stay at the top longer than others, but the shape of their career is usually similar. Rise, peak, plateau, decline. What Messi did was something different. His career trajectory is not a single arc. It is a series of transformations, each of which preserved his effectiveness while fundamentally changing how that effectiveness was generated. The young Messi was primarily a dribbler. He won matches by taking people on, by beating multiple defenders in sequence, and won by driving from deep into the penalty area with a ball at his feet that seemed magnetically attached to him. His directness was his primary weapon. He moved at defenders. He created chaos. He was physically fast, deceptively strong through his low center of gravity, and essentially unstoppable when he chose to run at you. By his late 20s, the directness had modulated. He was still capable of the solo dribbling runs that had defined his younger game, but they were less frequent and more precisely timed. What had grown in their place was a different kind of influence, a deeper understanding of positioning, of timing, of when to hold the ball and when to release it, of how to use a small movement of the body to open large corridors of space. He had become a reader of the game at a level that was almost architectural. He could see the structure of the opposing defense as a coherent whole and identify the exact point of its maximum weakness, with a speed and precision that suggested he was operating from a body of knowledge the rest of the field simply did not have access to. By his early 30s, he had evolved again. The physical markers of his game, the acceleration, the top speed, the ability to absorb contact and continue dribbling, were no longer what they had been. But by this point, the cognitive dimension of his game was so developed, so refined, so precise, that he barely needed the physical attributes he had partially lost. He moved less, he touched the ball less, but every touch, every movement, every decision was executed with such precise placement and such accurate timing that the effect on the game remained immense. This capacity for self-transformation is one of the rarest things in elite sport. It requires a willingness to honestly confront what is changing in your game and to genuinely let go of elements that have been central to your identity. It requires the humility to become a different kind of player, even when the old version of yourself was magnificent. Most elite athletes struggle to make this transition because the old version of themselves is where their identity lives, where their confidence is rooted. To let it go feels like a kind of self-abandonment. Messi made the transition multiple times without visible drama, without loss of identity, without a career crisis. He simply observed what was true about himself at each stage of his development and adjusted accordingly. He was always, in his own way, the same Messi. But the mechanism through which he expressed that identity evolved with extraordinary intelligence. What is perhaps most instructive about this self-transformation is the timing of each transition. Messi never tried to hold on to a previous version of his game past its expiry date. This is one of the hardest things for elite athletes to do, because their previous self is where their confidence is rooted, where their identity as a competitor was built. To let it go requires a form of courage that is rarely named as such, but is genuinely profound. The courage to become someone slightly different, to build a new identity from different materials, to trust that what you are becoming is as valuable as what you were. When Barcelona played the 2011 Champions League final against Manchester United at Wembley, the version of Messi that dominated that match was a different player from the one who had dominated the 2009 final against the same opponent in Rome. The 2009 Messi operated primarily on directness, on the dribbling run, on the burst of acceleration that left defenders behind. The 2011 Messi operated on a more complex register, movement between the lines, precise, short passing, the willingness to play simple and then be decisive at the exact right moment. The transition between those two versions, subtle to the casual observer, represented an enormous evolution in his understanding of and approach to the game. He was not declining, he was deepening, and this deepening continued past 30. The Messi who played in the 2022 World Cup was not trying to recreate any earlier version of himself. He was operating from a specific and refined understanding of what he could do at that age and in that body. And he was doing it with such precision and such timing that he was, over the course of 6 weeks, indisputably the best player on earth. That a 35-year-old, in the most physically demanding tournament in the sport, could achieve that result speaks not to some preservation of his youth, but to the ongoing evolution of his intelligence. He had, by that point, accumulated so much understanding of the game that the physical elements of his performance required only to be adequate, not extraordinary, for the total effect to be extraordinary. The 10th principle, and in many ways the most elusive to articulate, is what might be called the quality of desire, the specific nature of what Messi actually wants. Most elite athletes can tell you, clearly and specifically, what they are chasing. They want the championship. They want to be the greatest of all time. They want to prove something to someone who doubted them. They want the record. They want the ring. The motivation is legible, and it is largely external. It is oriented toward an outcome that can be measured and recognized and announced. Messi's desire is harder to locate. When you listen to him speak about football, in the rare moments when he speaks at length about the game rather than about his teammates or his gratitude, what comes through is something that sounds more like love than ambition. He talks about the ball, about how it feels, about what the game looks like when it is flowing correctly, when the passes are connecting and the space is opening and everything is working the way it is supposed to work. He talks about these things with an attention and a tenderness that you do not hear from athletes who are primarily motivated by winning. This does not mean he does not care about winning. He is one of the most decorated athletes in the history of sport. He has won at every level the game offers. He cares about winning with every cell of his body. But the desire to win appears to be downstream of something more fundamental. It appears to be downstream of a desire to be fully present in the game, to experience the game at its highest level, to make the ball do what only he can make it do. Winning is the proof that the game was played at its highest level. But the game itself, the act of playing, the experience of being on the pitch and being fully inside the flow of a match, that appears to be the primary source of his drive. This distinction matters enormously. It is the difference between a player who plays to accumulate and a player who plays because playing is itself the point. The player who plays to accumulate is always in a particular kind of danger. Every achievement creates a new question. Is this enough? Do I have enough yet? The player who plays because the playing is the point never has to ask that question. The game is always the answer to itself. Jorge Valdano once wrote that Messi is the only player he has ever seen who seems genuinely surprised every time he does something brilliant, that other people find it remarkable. Not false modesty, genuine incomprehension. Because from inside his experience, he was simply doing what felt natural to him, what was available to him in that moment, what the game was offering. The fact that the rest of the world found it extraordinary was, to him, a slightly puzzling external response to something that felt, from inside, like just playing football. This quality, the innocence of the extraordinary, is perhaps the deepest secret of his longevity. Players who are aware of their own greatness in a self-conscious way carry a particular burden. They must maintain the performance. They must live up to the reputation. Every match is an audition for the version of themselves that exists in the world's imagination. Messi does not seem to carry that burden. He walks onto the pitch and he plays. The reputation looks after itself. His attention is on the game. These 10 principles, the obsessive repetition that builds automatic mastery, the radical simplicity of decision-making, the economy of physical self-knowledge, the discipline of emotional architecture, the geometry of invisible influence, the constant and hidden competitive vigilance, the architecture of relationship, the sustained engagement with long failure, the temporal intelligence that enables self-transformation, and the quality of desire rooted in love rather than accumulation, do not exist in isolation. They form a single coherent system. They are mutually reinforcing. Each one supports and amplifies the others. The obsessive repetition that builds mastery feeds the simplicity of decision-making, because when your movements are automatic, you do not need to think about how to execute them, only about which option to choose. The simplicity of decision-making feeds the emotional architecture, because when you trust your instincts and your preparation, you do not need to manage anxiety about performance. The emotional architecture feeds the competitive vigilance, because when your feelings are not leaking through the surface, they are available as fuel for the engine running underneath. The architecture of relationship feeds the collective dimension of the game, which feeds the capacity for sustained engagement with failure, because you're never just fighting for yourself. The temporal intelligence feeds the quality of desire, because a player who can transform themselves over decades is a player who remains genuinely curious about what the game has still to offer them. These 10 principles, the obsessive repetition that builds automatic mastery, the radical simplicity of decision-making, the economy of physical self-knowledge, the discipline of emotional architecture, the geometry of invisible influence, the constant and hidden competitive vigilance, the architecture of relationship, the sustained engagement with long failure, the temporal intelligence that enables self-transformation, and the quality of desire rooted in love rather than accumulation, do not exist in isolation. They form a single coherent system. They are mutually reinforcing. Each one supports and amplifies the others. The obsessive repetition that builds mastery feeds the simplicity of decision-making, because when your movements are automatic, you do not need to think about how to execute them, only about which option to choose. The simplicity of decision-making feeds the emotional architecture, because when you trust your instincts and your preparation, you do not need to manage anxiety about performance. The emotional architecture feeds the competitive vigilance, because when your feelings are not leaking through the surface, they are available as fuel for the engine running underneath. The architecture of relationship feeds the collective dimension of the game, which feeds the capacity for sustained engagement with failure, because you are never just fighting for yourself. The temporal intelligence feeds the quality of desire, Because a player who can transform themselves over decades is a player who remains genuinely curious about what the game has still to offer them. What is also important to understand about this system is that none of these principles operated in a vacuum from the people around him. The coaches who understood him gave him freedom. Guardiola gave him the tactical liberty to interpret his role in the false nine as he saw fit, to drop deep when he wanted, to drift wide when he sensed the opportunity. Frank Rijkaard, who first gave him sustained first-team opportunities, trusted him when other managers might have been cautious about playing a 17-year-old in the highest stakes matches. These decisions by coaches who were willing to step back and create space for his intelligence to operate were essential conditions for his development. The principles Messi embodied were necessary but not sufficient. They required an environment that could recognize and accommodate them. He was fortunate in that regard, and he understood that he was fortunate. His consistent acknowledgement of the role of teammates and coaches and family in his success is not performative humility. It reflects an accurate understanding of how excellence is actually produced. This is not an accident. This is not the result of coaching or of a carefully constructed program. It is the result of a deep and total orientation toward football as a way of being in the world. Messi did not design these principles and then implement them. They emerged from who he was, from a shy boy in Rosario who found in a football the thing that made him most completely himself, and then spent the next 4 decades refining and deepening that relationship with total and absolute commitment. There is a pattern that emerges when you study careers across multiple decades, a pattern that appears in the very greatest competitors across all sports and all disciplines. It is the pattern of the person who cannot be separated from their work, because the work is not something they do, but something they are. The footballer who plays because he loves football in a way that is indistinguishable from who he is as a person. The scientist who investigates because curiosity is not a mood for them, but a permanent state. The musician who practices because the act of making music is where they are most fully alive. This pattern is visible throughout Messi's career, again and again, across different teams and different coaches and different tactical systems, in different phases of his physical development. At every stage, regardless of the external circumstances, he maintained the same fundamental relationship with the game. He was always most alive on the football pitch. He was always most himself with the ball. The game was not his job, it was his home. This is part of why the debates about his legacy are, in a certain sense, beside the point. Whether he is the greatest of all time or not is a question that belongs to historians and to those who love the sport and want to understand its contours. But the question of what kind of person and what kind of mind produced what he produced is a different question, and it is the question that matters most for anyone who wants to understand how sustained excellence is actually built. The answer, drawn from his life and career, is that it is built through a total alignment between who you are and what you do. It is built through the refusal to separate the work from the self. It is built through the patient accumulation of mastery that never announces itself and never stops accumulating. It is built through a relationship with failure that neither denies it nor is destroyed by it. It is built through the transformation of natural gifts, however extraordinary, into something even more extraordinary through decades of obsessive and specific work. But perhaps, more than anything, it is built through the quality of attention. Messi's attention, in football, is total and permanent. From the 4-year-old who made the ball stick to the 35-year-old who lifted the World Cup, the quality of his attention never diminished. He was always watching, always learning, always adjusting, always finding, in the same game he had been playing for 30 years, something new to understand. The game never became routine to him. The ball never became familiar enough to be taken for granted. The opponent in front of him in any given match was always a specific, interesting problem that deserved his complete attention and his best answer. This freshness of engagement, this refusal to allow mastery to become complacency, is perhaps the quietest and most important secret in his entire story. That quality of attention is, in the end, the most transferable and the most universally instructive thing about his career. Most of us will never be able to do what Messi did with a football, but the quality of attention he brought to it, that sustained, curious, honest, patient, and total attention directed at the thing that most fully expresses who we are, that is something else. That is something that belongs to the category of human capacity rather than individual genius. That is something that can be studied and, in whatever domain we live and work in, genuinely approached. He scored his first official goal for Barcelona's first team on May 1st, 2005, at the age of 17. He scored his last goal for Barcelona in the 2020-2021 season, which ended with his departure from the club, an exit that was determined not by his decline as a player, but by the financial collapse of the institution that had formed him. He had spent 21 years at Barcelona, arriving as a frightened, silent, small boy from Argentina, and leaving as the greatest player the club had ever seen, arguably the greatest the sport had ever produced. What he had built in those 21 years was not just a record of achievement, though the records are extraordinary and will almost certainly stand for a generation. What he built was a model of what total commitment to a craft looks like across a lifetime, a model of what it means to take whatever gifts you were given and apply to them a level of work and attention so sustained and so precise that the result transcends the gifts themselves, a model of what it means to remain curious about your own work across decades, to keep finding in it new depths and new questions. When he arrived at Paris Saint-Germain after Barcelona, and then when he moved to Inter Miami in the United States, many observers expected to see the story of a great player winding down, playing out the final chapters in comfortable exile. What they saw instead was a player who continued to perform at an elite level, continued to add dimensions to his game, continued to find within himself reserves of quality that should, by the standard calculations of athletic decline, have been exhausted long since. He won the World Cup at 35. He won the Copa America at 33. He continued to be the best player in almost every match he entered until deep into the age at which most footballers have already retired. This is the final, perhaps most important thing to understand about Messi. He is not a story that ends. He is a principle in motion. He is a demonstration, ongoing and accumulating, of what happens when a human being finds the thing that most completely expresses who they are, and then gives it everything. In 2022, on a hot night in Lusail, Qatar, Lionel Messi lifted the FIFA World Cup above his head. He wore the bisht, the traditional black robe placed on him by the Emir of Qatar, over his Argentina shirt. He held the trophy, he looked at it, he closed his eyes. And the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had finally got what he deserved. It was the expression of a man who had finally put something down, something he had been carrying for a very long time, something heavy and private and real. Around him were his teammates, Rodrigo de Paul, who had run himself into the ground in every match of the tournament, Angel Di Maria, who had been one of the finest players in Argentine football history and who had never won the trophy either, Julian Alvarez, 22 years old, who had grown up watching Messi and was now standing beside him with a World Cup medal around his neck. They embraced, they wept, they held each other with the specific tenderness of people who have been through something together that they will never fully be able to explain to anyone who was not there. Messi, in that moment, was many things. He was the greatest footballer of his generation, perhaps of all time. He was a boy from Rosario who had carried a dream for 30 years and refused, despite everything, to put it down. He was a father, thinking, those who knew him said, about his 3 sons and about what he wanted to show them. He was a man who had built something extraordinary, not through a single act of genius, but through the accumulated quality of a lifetime's attention, a lifetime's work, a lifetime's love of the game. But perhaps most clearly, he was the same person he had always been. The shy boy who barely spoke, the one who did not celebrate loudly or hang his head after mistakes, the one who processed everything internally and moved to the next moment, the one who was most fully alive with the ball at his feet and the pitch opening up in front of him. He was the same. The circumstances had simply, finally arranged themselves around him in a way that matched what he had always deserved. That alignment between a person and the thing they were born to do, between decades of total effort and a single, culminating night, is what the study of Messi's career ultimately gives us. Not a blueprint, not a formula, not a set of instructions for how to become great, but something more important than any of those things, a witness. A full and documented and analyzed account of what it looks like when a human being gives themselves completely to something, maintains that giving across every kind of difficulty, and arrives at the end of a long road, at the place where the work and the life are finally won. And that account matters not only to football fans or to students of sport, but to anyone who has ever cared about something deeply and found themselves asking whether that caring alone could be enough. Messi's life answers that question, not with words, but with action, with 30 years of showing up, with 30 years of attending completely, with 30 years of choosing, in every training session and in every match, to be fully present to the thing that made him most himself. There's nothing more to add to that. The career speaks. The ball rolled and rolled and rolled again, always at his feet, always moving forward. This is what it looks like. This is what it costs, and this is what it is worth.